The Pokemon timeline is one of the most popular theory topics out there. I've probably watched dozens of videos on it over the years, and I won't go over the details of the relationships between the games. That's kind of been done to death. But in researching this video, I did look at some specific ones that I wanted to mention. I looked at videos by Tamashi, Candy Eevee, Matt Pat, Birdkeeper Toby, Almighty Arceus, and Loxton. And up until Generation 5, things were fairly tidy. There was that famous tweet that established things with Generation 1 and its remakes, as well as Generation 3 at the very beginning. And then 3 years later, Generation 2 and its remakes, as well as Generation 4. And then some unknown amount of time from just a few years to close to 15 years before Black and White. And then, of course, 2 years before Black and White 2. But from Generation 6 on, things started to get a little bit more messy, and of course that was because of Oraz and the Delta episode, which essentially cleaved the Pokemon universe into the non-Mega and the Mega timelines. And it also established the greater Pokemon multiverse. So not only are the remakes a separate universe from the original games, and not only are the individual versions from each generation separate universes as well, but every copy of the game, every playthrough, is its own universe. And this explosion of universes created a problem. And I have not seen a fully satisfactory timeline theory since then. Candy Eevee's, I think, got the closest, but Toby and Arceus already pointed out some flaws with it. And of course, it was from back in the Sun and Moon days. The Ultra games complicated things even more by establishing that there are timelines that we don't actually see in the main series games. The Giovanni from Rainbow Rocket never faced Red at all, and actually all of the evil team leaders from Rainbow Rocket are winners from their timelines. And we also get to explore many Ultra worlds, including Guzzlord's world, Ultra Ruin, which is just a ruined version of Hau'oli City. So maybe all of the other Ultra worlds are also just versions of the known Pokemon world. And then maybe Ultra Space is just the connective tissue that you can somehow poke through to travel between universes. And with the release of Sword and Shield coming up soon, we start to think about where that is going to fit in with the timeline. But honestly, what I've been wondering is if that might be a futile exercise. Let me go over some of the problems that I see with the established timelines. And the problems actually start even before Generation 5, as early as Generation 2, when we see that the volcano on Cinnabar Island has erupted. Except that Cinnabar did not have a volcano in Generation 1. The idea of the volcano in Cinnabar was sort of a leak in from the anime. In-game, there was no volcano to erupt. In Let's Go, there is still no volcano in sight, but at least in the illustrated map, you do see that it is on the west side of the island surrounded by a small forest, so at least there's that. But there is a similar problem with the Sevi Islands. They play a major role in Fire Red and Leaf Green, but nobody mentions them in Red, Blue, and Yellow, or even in Let's Go, or I think, any other game except for Emerald. In Kalos, you meet a backpacker who will give you the strange souvenir, and through that and your other interactions with him, it's implied that he is from Alola. And he says that our champion is something else, which implies that Alola has a champion. But Alola, as we know, doesn't have a proper champion until the very end of the game, so that must mean that the Alola games take place before the Kalos games, right? Except that in Alola, you also meet Dexio and Sina from Kalos, and they mention their past and a group of 5 trainers who are obviously the protagonists from X and Y and their companions. So that must mean that the Alola games take place after Kalos. It doesn't add up. One question that people like to bring up is the characters that you see in the battle tree in Generation 7, because in the Alola games, Red and Blue are clearly shown to have aged. Grimsley, Colress, and Annabelle also got significant redesigns, but Wally, who you meet in the battle tree, looks exactly the same, and so does Cynthia. There's the same situation with characters in the Pokemon World Tournament in Generation 5, who all look identical to their previous iterations, including Red and Blue. My take on this used to be that these post-game areas, these faux competitive events, are not fully canonical, maybe because they are optional. Candy Eevee's explanation, though, is that the characters don't get a redesign unless it's important, which is a really good explanation as well. Here's another couple minor ones that I haven't seen a lot of people talking about. In X and Y, as we've talked about, not a lot is really known about Mega Evolution. But in ORAS, which, remember, is supposed to take place before X and Y, the Devon Corporation uses Mega Evolution energy to power gadgets and other machines in the Pokemon world. And for that, you have to know how that energy works. Maybe not how it affects Pokemon necessarily, but at least how to harness it, which seems to be more than Sycamore knows. And Archie, the leader of Team Aqua, flip-flops between not just character designs, but races. He's white in Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, black in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, and white again in Ultra Sun and Moon. And let's not forget that ORAS just can't take place at the same time as Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. Mauville City looks completely different, and Mount Pyre is not all broken down anymore. And it also can't take place in the same timeline, just at a different point in time, because the events of Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald didn't happen. Birdkeeper Toby and Almighty Arceus made a whole video just about this, and their explanation is that ORAS actually takes place on a shifted timeline, so it's actually a little bit closer to the time of X and Y than Red, Blue, and Yellow and the original Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. And this works pretty well, but I think it ignores something that a lot of timeline theories ignore. Pokemon is very meta. I mean, everyone knows that Pokemon is very meta. The developers insert themselves into many of the games. The 7.8 out of 10 too much water meme is in there. Lord Helix has been referenced, and even Cerebi's Poke-Earth map has made an appearance. But I don't think that people really talk about how this affects the timeline, or at least our interpretations of it. It's no coincidence that overall, the in-game timeline matches pretty closely with the release timeline of the games. Mimikyu being jealous of Pikachu's popularity from 20 years ago, that was the height of Pokemania. Remember that Sun and Moon came out on the 20th anniversary year, so that's an obvious reference. Same with Porygon being made from 20-year-old technology. To me, lines like this bugcatcher who says that Pokemon Centers used to have 2 stories until 10 years ago is not so much a reference to an actual in-game timeline, but to previous iterations of that world. Same with the comment about Mount Pyre being broken down in the past. It's not so much that they fixed it. It's in our past that it used to have holes in the ground. But there were 3 things in Let's Go that completely broke my faith in the timeline. The first is that Blue never had a Pokedex, which means Red didn't either. But obviously, they did have a Pokedex in Red, Blue, and Yellow, and Fire Red and Leaf Green. They also never fought Team Rocket, which means that Let's Go can't really take place after Red, Blue, and Yellow or Fire Red and Leaf Green, or even really be considered their mega timeline equivalents because it's not Red's story. The second thing is that Mina is in it. She looks to be about the player's age, maybe just a little bit older, and some concept art suggests that she is between 13 and 15 years old, but she can't age the same as Red and Blue and still be a trial captain by the time of Sun and Moon, because trial captains have to give up their spot when they turn 20. And Red and Blue's ages between Let's Go and Sun and Moon are definitely more than 6 years apart. So that already necessarily places Let's Go on its own timeline. The third thing is that Pokemon can Mega Evolve, but they can't evolve into their regular evolutions, and their babies also don't seem to exist. So you can have Mega Pidgeot, but you can't have Crobat? Or Pichu? And correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think anyone in these games even mentions those evolutions. I've seen some people suggest that there are 3 or even 4 different major timelines, but at this point, looking at all of these inconsistencies, I just don't think there is one. Unless the games are explicit sequels like Generation 2 was to Generation 1, or Black and White 2 to Black and White the original, which, by the way, should happen more often. Let's have sequels instead of remakes, how about that? The Pokemon games just don't follow a consistent timeline. They will often reference other games or events in other games, but they also reference real-world memes, things from the anime or even the manga. So unless you want to find a timeline that can tie all of that together, which is impossible because those are different canons that often contradict each other, you just have to accept that a consistent timeline just isn't a thing. Every new release creates a new kind of corner of the multiverse with its own semi-consistent timeline, but that won't always accurately match to what we've seen before. Now, if you've been watching me for a while, you know that I don't like this conclusion. I don't like throwing away in-game evidence. I always prefer an in-game explanation, even when the real-world explanation makes more sense. But I feel like the existence of the multiverse and those inconsistent timelines sort of are in-game evidence that other in-game evidence just isn't valid. Just like in the past when we threw away Pokédex evidence because it wasn't internally consistent. All that being said, though, I do still think that all of the games exist in a sort of, let's call it a shared metaverse, with mostly internally consistent rules and many events that are the same throughout. So it's not like all cross-generational theory crafting is moot. All of that is still very interesting and I think very useful for understanding their world, or worlds. I would love to hear your thoughts on the Pokemon timeline. If you enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate it if you could share it, and if you're new here, please consider subscribing. I'm Umbreon Libris, and I'll see you in the next chapter.